Emily sat by the window, gripping the armrest. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, she had never flown alone before, and her heart raced in a way she could not explain. The hum of the engines beneath her felt foreign, like a beast waking up inside her stomach, and every bump of the plane on the tarmac made her stomach churn with unease. She tried to calm herself with deep breaths, but the air seemed to get thicker as the plane picked up speed. She glanced around at the other passengers. Most of them looked calm, some even smiled, and chatted like they were in a cafe. But not her. She felt as though every inch of the plane was a reminder of her own fear. Each creak of the cabin made her pulse quicken, and her hands turned cold. Despite the warmth of the air conditioning, she was now entering an unfamiliar world, one where the sky was no longer a comforting sight, but a vast unknown threatening to swallow her whole. The captain's voice came over the intercom, a clear and steady tone saying we are cleared for takeoff. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world outside the window blurred into streaks of color. As the plane surged forward, the ground beneath them disappeared, and for a moment Emily felt like she was falling, like the world was spinning too fast. She squeezed her eyes shut and fought the panic rising in her chest. But it was like trying to stop a storm with her bare hands. She opened her eyes briefly to see the city below shrinking smaller and smaller until it was just a patchwork of roads and houses. The feeling of being untethered to the earth sent a jolt through her, and she clutched the armrest harder, her knuckles turning white. The woman sitting beside her noticed the way her fingers gripped the seat and turned to her with a knowing smile. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it. In no time," she said, her voice calm, like this was just another day. But Emily could barely hear her. The sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears was all she could focus on. She nodded politely, though her thoughts were a swirl of anxiety. What if something went wrong? What if this was the last thing she would ever experience? What if she never made it back down to the ground? Emily tried to steady herself, focusing on the deep breaths. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, smiling, chatting with passengers, going about their work as if this was the most routine thing in the world. Emily envied them, the ease with which they moved through the cabin, as though they had done this 1,000 times before. She watched them with a mix of curiosity and jealousy. How could they be so calm? She wondered, why was she the only one who felt like she was on the edge of something terrible? The plane leveled out, and the sounds of the engines became a steady hum. But to Emily, it was deafening. The vibration of the plane seemed to rattle her very bones. She glanced around at the other passengers. Still they sat relaxed, some even closing their eyes, as if this was a peaceful train ride across the countryside. She couldn't understand it. How could they be so calm? Was it a trick? Were they pretending? She could feel the sweat on her palms. Slowly dampening the armrest, she reached for the small bottle of water in her bag, but her hands were trembling too much to open it. She watched the flight attendants move up and down the aisles, laughing, talking to passengers, their faces painted with the same practiced smiles, as if they were not thousands of feet above the earth, in a cramped metal tube, surrounded by nothing but sky. She wanted to ask them how they stayed so calm, how they didn't feel the way she did. But she kept her mouth shut. She didn't want to seem foolish. She didn't want anyone to see how terrified she really was. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, trying to get comfortable. But the tightness in her chest wouldn't go away with every slight movement of the plane. It felt as if the world was shifting beneath her, and she wasn't sure if it was the turbulence or the anxiety taking over her mind. The woman next to her was asleep now, her head resting against the window, and Emily tried to focus on her deep breathing again. But it wasn't working. It never worked. She just couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, that something was about to happen. She had heard stories about things that could go wrong on flights, and now every little sound, every movement seemed to confirm her fear. She watched the flight attendants more closely this time, her eyes scanning for any sign of distress. Their calm faces were beginning to seem too calm. Was this normal? Was something wrong? Were they hiding something from the passengers? It was like she was the only one who could sense the danger the only one who could feel the tension in the air. The plane shifted slightly, and Emily's heart skipped a beat. She froze in her seat, eyes darting toward the overhead compartment, afraid something might fall down. But nothing did. Still, the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. Every second felt like an eternity. She glanced out the window, hoping to ground herself to the sight of the world below. But all she saw was endless blue, the clouds stretching on like an ocean of white foam. And then she saw it a flicker on the horizon, a dark shadow that seemed to move against the current of the sky. It was so far away. But it caught her attention. It seemed to grow larger as the plane moved closer, and she couldn't take her eyes off of it. She blinked several times. But it didn't disappear. It was like a storm cloud slowly creeping toward them. She tried to push the thought away, but it clung to her mind like a vice. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. But this time it wasn't his usual calm, reassuring tone. His words were clipped and purposeful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered an unexpected situation. Please remain calm, and we will update you shortly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her body stiffened, her mind racing. A cold chill spread through her, and she could feel the eyes of the other passengers slowly turning toward each other, as if they were all sensing it too. The calm before the storm had shattered, and something was about to happen. She could feel it. Emily's heart raced as the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. Once more his tone was sharper now, and she could feel the air around her growing thicker. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats. The chatter that had filled the cabin moments earlier now replaced by a heavy silence. A sense of collective unease filled the space. The dark shadow she had seen out of the window had not disappeared. It seemed to hover in the distance, growing larger and darker with each passing moment. She tried to calm herself by focusing on her breath, but it was impossible. Her chest felt tight. With each inhale, the weight of the air around her seemed to press down harder. The flight attendants moved more briskly. Now their faces no longer cheerful, but focused. They exchanged glances with one another, their smiles gone, their eyes showing just a flicker of worry. Emily caught sight of one of them whispering to another in hushed tones. The words were too quiet for her to hear, but the way they spoke sent a chill down her spine. It was like a secret was being shared, like something was happening that they weren't telling the passengers. She wanted to ask them what was going on, but the words wouldn't leave her throat. All she could do was sit there and watch as the plane rocked slightly, the shadows outside growing darker. Still, the turbulence wasn't anything extreme, but it was enough to make her stomach lurch in a way she hadn't felt before. The low hum of the engines was drowned out by the pounding of her own heartbeat. She glanced around at the other passengers. Some were still calm, but others were now shifting in their seats, eyes wide with concern. Emily noticed a man across the aisle clutching the armrest, his knuckles turning white. He glanced at her, and for a brief moment their eyes locked, both of them understanding the fear in each other's gaze. It was the first time all flight that she felt like someone else truly understood her anxiety. The moment was interrupted by the captain's voice again. This time the words were more alarming than she expected. We are currently adjusting our altitude to avoid a potential weather system ahead. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. There's no cause for alarm, but we'll keep you informed with updates as soon as possible. The plane jolted again, more forcefully this time, and Emily's stomach twisted. She could feel her body tense, like a bowstring pulled too tight. She looked out the window again, hoping to see something familiar. But instead all she could see was the endless stretch of clouds below, and the menacing shadow now engulfing the sky. The turbulence wasn't just random anymore. It was deliberate, like the plane was trying to avoid something or escape from something, as if it knew something the passengers didn't. Emily swallowed hard, her mouth dry with fear. Her thoughts raced. What was happening? What had the captain meant by adjusting the altitude? Why was the weather system so dangerous? What did they know that she didn't? She wanted answers. But the more she thought about it, the more the fear gripped her mind. The cold chill that had spread through her was now a full-on shiver, As the turbulence continued, the whispers among the passengers grew louder. People were starting to talk now, but their voices were filled with uncertainty. No one knew what was going on. No one could explain it. And no one was prepared for the reality that was quickly unfolding around them. Emily's hands shook as she gripped the armrest. Once more her thoughts a blur of fear and confusion. She had thought she could handle this flight. She had convinced herself that it would be over soon, but now she wasn't sure what was waiting for her at the end of it. All she knew was that this wasn't going to be like any flight she had ever experienced before. The plane rocked again, more violently this time, sending a ripple of panic through the cabin. The air felt charged, like something was about to happen, something no one could predict. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting around the cabin. She watched the flight attendants, now moving with purpose, their earlier calm replaced by a subtle urgency. One of them walked down the aisle with a grim expression, her eyes scanning the cabin, as though looking for something or someone. Emily tried to focus on her breathing, but it was no use. The air felt too thick, too heavy. Every movement in the cabin seemed amplified. Every sound felt too loud. The whispers between passengers grew louder, their voices low but frantic. What was going on? People were beginning to fidget in their seats, shifting their eyes nervously toward the windows. Emily could hear someone muttering about turbulence, something about the weather system, but it was all fragmented. No one really knew what was happening. And the more Emily listened, the more the fear inside her grew worse. The overhead lights flickered for a brief moment, and then went out, plunging the cabin into an eerie darkness. The only light came from the emergency exit signs, glowing faintly in the dimness. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the captain's voice came again, this time strained, more hurried than before. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing unusual conditions in the air, and will be diverting our flight to an alternate route. Please stay seated with your seatbelt fastened, and do not attempt to move about the cabin. The calmness in his voice didn't match the growing tension in the air. Emily could feel the panic rising in her chest again. Her hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles aching. She glanced out the window and saw nothing but thick clouds swirling around them. She couldn't tell where the plane was or where it was heading anymore. All she could see were the endless clouds pressing in from all sides. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, willing the panic to subside. But it didn't. It only grew worse. The sense of being trapped in an endless void of sky was overwhelming. She tried to look at the other passengers, but most of them had their eyes closed or were staring blankly ahead, lost in their own thoughts of fear. But she couldn't escape the growing dread. What was out there in the sky? What were they avoiding? What had the captain meant by unusual conditions? Something in the back of her mind whispered that it was more than just turbulence, more than just bad weather. She had a feeling, she couldn't shake it, gnawed at her gut like a dark secret. She didn't want to know. She glanced again at the flight attendants, who were now exchanging urgent words. In hushed tones, one of them looked back at the passengers, their eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Emily's stomach dropped as the plane shook again, more violently this time. The force of it caused her to grip the armrest even harder. The woman sitting beside her woke up with a start, her eyes wide with confusion and then panic. She looked out the window, her expression changing to one of worry. What was happening? What had they encountered? What was so dangerous out there that the captain was now diverting the flight? Emily could feel the eyes of the passengers on her now as the plane continued to shake and sway. But no one spoke. No one dared to ask the questions on everyone's mind. The darkness outside the window was no longer just clouds. It was something more. It was a presence, something unknown, something that seemed to be pressing in closer and closer around them. The turbulence hit again, this time even harder. The plane dipped violently, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. The screams of startled passengers mixed with the deafening roar of the engines as the plane swayed like a leaf in the wind. Emily's stomach lurched as the force pressed her back into her seat. Her heart raced faster and faster with each violent jolt of the plane. She could feel the blood draining from her face, her breath coming in short gasps. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Her body was frozen in place, her hands clenching so tightly around the armrest that her fingers ached. But she couldn't let go, she had to hold on. She could hear the flight attendants rushing through the aisles, now their footsteps quick and purposeful. The air had thickened. It felt like the entire plane was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something terrible. The captain's voice came through the intercom again, but it was almost drowned out by the noise of the shaking cabin. He sounded strained, his words hurried and clipped. "We are encountering some severe conditions. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened at all times. There's no need to panic. We are doing everything we can." Emily closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her thoughts, but it was impossible. The fear had taken over completely. She opened her eyes and saw the woman beside her gripping the armrest with white knuckles, her eyes wide and full of fear. Emily tried to speak to her, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the fear in the other woman's eyes, the same fear. She felt deep inside herself. Suddenly, the plane lurched again, this time even more violently, and Emily gasped as the lights flickered once more, before plunging them into darkness. For a few seconds, a heavy silence filled the cabin like the calm before a storm. Then a single voice broke the quiet. It was a voice that didn't belong to any of the flight attendants or the captain, but a voice that had been carefully hidden until now. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The voice was soft but clear. It was coming from the back of the plane, not from the intercom, but directly from the passengers. It was a woman's voice, but it sounded strange, distant, almost as if it was being spoken from far away. "Please do not be alarmed, but we have a situation. We are currently altering our course. The captain will inform you shortly." Emily's blood ran cold. The voice was calm, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. It was as though the speaker was detached from the reality of the moment, her words hanging in the air, like an echo from somewhere distant, somewhere unimportant. She tried to make sense of what she had just heard. Had someone else heard it too? Was she imagining things? But then she saw it. The flight attendants were moving even more quickly now, their faces pale, their eyes darting from one passenger to another, as though searching for something. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as if they were struggling to remain calm, despite the fear that was slowly overtaking the cabin. It wasn't just the turbulence that had everyone on edge. It was something more, something that could not be seen, something that was out there just beyond the clouds. The plane shuddered again, and this time Emily couldn't stop herself from letting out a small cry. The passengers around her were all silent now, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. No one knew what was happening. No one could understand why the plane was being forced to change course. But the unease in the air was palpable, like a dark cloud settling over them all. Emily's eyes flicked to the window once again. The shadow she had seen earlier was closer now. It was unmistakable. It was a shape, a dark mass in the sky that shouldn't have been there, something that felt wrong, something that wasn't natural. The plane shook again, this time a sharp jolt that seemed to come from nowhere. The lights flickered once more before cutting out completely, leaving the cabin submerged in total darkness. The only sound now was the relentless roar of the engines and the trembling hum of the plane's body vibrating under the force of the turbulence. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped the armrest, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't control. The voice she had heard earlier still echoed in her mind, that cold, distant tone that had made her blood run cold. Who was it? Where had it come from? Why wasn't anyone reacting to it? More, it felt like the announcement was meant for her alone, like it was trying to tell her something. But no one else seemed to notice. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong outside the plane, something out there just beyond the swirling clouds, something unseen, but palpably close. She could feel it in the air, a weight pressing down on her chests, something pressing in from all sides. She glanced around at the other passengers. Some were clutching their seats, eyes wide with fear, while others simply stared ahead, lost in their own world of terror, their faces pale in the dim light. The woman beside her was shaking now, her hands gripping the armrest tightly, her face a mirror of Emily's own fear. Emily wanted to speak to her, to say something, anything, but the words caught in her throat. No one seemed to know what to say. No one seemed to have any answers. The silence in the cabin grew heavier with each passing moment, the unease gnawing at her insides as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. And then the voice came again, this time more urgent, more insistent, but still distant, still detached. Please, remain calm. We are attempting to correct our course. It won't be long until we reach a safer altitude. Please stay seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. Emily's pulse quickened. As the message ended, she didn't feel calm. She didn't feel safe. The words, the voice, they weren't comforting. They only made everything feel more uncertain, more unreal. She wanted to look out the window again to see if she could make sense of what was happening. But the darkness outside offered no clues, only the swirling clouds that seemed to close in tighter with every passing moment. The plane lurched again with more force this time, and Emily gasped involuntarily as the seatbelt pressed painfully against her waist. The turbulence was unrelenting, and she could feel herself losing control. The air around her seemed to hum with a strange tension, a feeling like something was pulling at the edges of her mind, something trying to break through. But she couldn't grasp it. She couldn't understand it. A flash of lightning briefly illuminated the cabin from outside, and for a split second Emily saw something in the sky, something that took her breath away. It was far off in the distance, but unmistakable, a massive dark shape against the clouds so large it seemed to stretch across the entire horizon. It wasn't a storm, it wasn't a cloud. It was something else, something unnatural. Emily froze, her eyes locked on the shape as the plane dipped again, plunging deeper into the turbulence. She could feel her pulse racing. Her hands were clammy as she gripped the armrest, and her breathing became shallow. She could feel a fear rising in her chest, like a wave about to crash over her. She tried to make sense of what she had seen, but the shape in the sky had already vanished. As quickly as it had appeared, she blinked several times, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But when she looked out the window again, it was gone. But the feeling remained, that heavy presence, that sense that something was wrong, something out there was moving toward them. And she wasn't sure they would make it out alive. She glanced at the other passengers, but no one had seen it, no one had reacted. Everyone was still lost in their own panic and confusion. The turbulence seemed to ease for a moment, but the tension in the air didn't subside. Emily's hands trembled as she held on to the armrest, her mind racing with the possibility of what was out there, the shape, the shadow in the sky. What was it? Was it a threat? Was it a warning? And was it coming closer? The plane seemed to calm for a brief moment as the turbulence subsided, but the air inside the cabin was anything but calm. It felt thick with fear. The hum of the engines was louder now, and Emily could hear the frantic whispers from the other passengers, their voices a low murmur of confusion and panic. No one knew what was happening. No one had any answers, and the sense of uncertainty was overwhelming. Emily couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen outside the window, the shape, the dark silhouette that had appeared for a split second like a shadow against the storm clouds. It had been enormous, so massive that it felt like it was swallowing the sky. She shuddered just thinking about it, and the fact that no one else seemed to notice made it even worse. It made her question her own sanity. Was it a figment of her imagination, or had something truly strange appeared in the sky? She couldn't say for sure. But the nagging feeling that they were being watched didn't go away, no matter how hard she tried to push it from her mind. The flight attendants were moving with purpose, now their faces grim, their usual calm demeanor replaced by a tense urgency. They spoke to each other in hushed tones, their eyes constantly scanning the cabin, as if they were looking for something or waiting for something. Emily caught a glimpse of one of them, exchanging a quick glance with another, and there was something in their eyes, something that spoke of fear. They were trying to keep up the act. They were trying to stay in control. But Emily could see through it now. She could see the cracks in their facade. The fear in their eyes was undeniable. She looked out the window again, searching for any sign of what was happening outside. But the clouds were too thick, the sky too dark. She couldn't see anything anymore. And that only made the feeling of dread grow stronger. The captain's voice came over the intercom again. But this time it was different. His usual calm and reassuring tone was gone, replaced by a tense urgency. As he spoke, "We are currently rerouting to an alternate airport. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. Do not attempt to leave your seats. The weather conditions are unpredictable. And we need to ensure your safety." Emily's stomach dropped. She felt the weight of his words pressed down on her, as if they were a warning. The turbulence was getting worse again. The plane rocked slightly back and forth, as if it were trying to find stability. But there was no stability to be found, no calm. To cling to it felt like the very air outside was pushing against them. And the more she thought about it, the more she wondered what they were running from. Was it the weather? Was it the storm outside? Or was it something else, something far more dangerous, something she couldn't see, but could feel pressing in on them? All her chest tightened with fear as her mind raced to find answers. But no answers came. The voice in her head screamed that they were not alone out there, that something was moving closer, something dangerous and unseen. The plane shook again, this time more violently than before. Emily gasped as the force sent a wave of panic through the cabin. The passengers were silent now, their fear palpable. She could hear the whispers around her, but no one dared speak above the whisper. Everyone knew something was terribly wrong, but no one knew what to do. The air in the cabin seemed to press down harder and harder until it felt like the plane was being squeezed by an invisible force. The turbulence grew worse again, but this time it wasn't just shaking the plane. It felt like it was pulling it, like something was tugging at the very heart of the aircraft, pulling them all into something darker, something more dangerous. She looked at the other passengers, their faces pale with fear. No one spoke, no one moved. It was as if they were all waiting for something to happen, waiting for the moment when everything would change forever. The plane dipped again, more violently this time, and Emily's stomach lurched as the entire cabin seemed to groan under the pressure. She clutched the armrest so tightly her fingers were numb, and the voices around her had become a low murmur of panic. The overhead lights flickered and then went out again, leaving them all in darkness. The hum of the engines felt like it was coming from far away, distant and muffled, as if the plane itself was becoming disconnected from reality. She could hear someone whispering nearby, but she couldn't make out the words. The fear was spreading through the cabin like wildfire now. No one was calm. No one could pretend anymore. They were all trapped here with something unknown pressing in on them. It felt like they were sinking into an endless void. And the darkness outside the window was not just the storm. It was something else, something more terrifying. It was as if the world itself had closed in around them, trapping them in a pocket of reality that didn't make sense. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to look out the window, but it was pointless. The darkness was too thick. The clouds swirling outside were impenetrable. And then the voice came again. But this time it wasn't through the intercom. It wasn't the captain's voice or any of the flight attendants. It came from somewhere deeper, from somewhere inside the cabin itself. It was the same soft, distant voice that had spoken earlier, but now it had changed. It was colder, sharper, more insistent. "Don't be afraid," the voice said. But the words didn't sound reassuring. They sounded like a command. Stay in your seats and remain calm. It will be over soon. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze as the words hung in the air. Emily's blood ran cold, and she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She looked around, but no one else seemed to react. No one else seemed to have heard the voice except her. And that only made it worse. Was she losing her mind? Was she hearing things? Or was this real? The panic in her chest threatened to overwhelm her, and she struggled to breathe. The plane shuddered again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the typical turbulence. It felt like the plane was being pulled in a direction they didn't want to go, a direction that was not part of the flight path. The lights flickered back on, and Emily blinked in the sudden brightness. But the cabin didn't look the same. It was the same passengers, the same seats. But the atmosphere had changed. The tension was unbearable. The fear was suffocating. And then she saw it outside the window. She saw it clearly. This time it was unmistakable. It was the same dark shape from before, the massive shadow that stretched across the sky. But this time it was closer, so much closer. It was right there, looming just beyond the clouds, massive and unnatural. It was not a storm. It was not a plane. It was something else, something that should not have been there, something that didn't belong. It was a presence, an entity in the sky. And it was closing in on them. Emily's breath hitched as she stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. The fear was no longer just in her mind. It was in the air around her. The plane was shaking again, this time with a force that made her feel like they were being pulled downward, pulled toward the darkness outside. And then there was a loud crack, a noise that sounded like metal twisting, and bending the entire plane, seemed to lurch as if it had been struck by an unseen force, and Emily screamed as the lights flickered again. And then the voice came back one final time, but this time it was not a calm command. It was an urgent cry, a desperate warning. We are not alone. And then the intercom went silent. The plane dipped again with a terrifying force, sending passengers gasping and clutching their seats as everything around them seemed to unravel. Emily's mind spun as she felt the weight of the moment crash down on her. They were not alone. They had never been alone. And whatever was outside was coming for them now.